Hello, welcome to another episode of Modern Cyber. I am thrilled today to be joined by somebody who comes from a little bit of a different background than some of our recent guests, from a field that is emerging in the cybersecurity space, but is super important and critical. And I think we're going to learn a lot from today's conversation. I am delighted to be joined today by Mr. Joe Saunders. Joe is the founder and CEO of RunSafe Security, a pioneer of cyber hardening technology for embedded systems, devices, and industrial control systems. Joe leads a team of former U.S. government cybersecurity specialists who know how attackers think about problems, how they weaponize attacks, and how they choose their targets. A 25-year veteran of many leadership and cybersecurity roles, Joe is on a personal mission to transform cybersecurity by challenging outdated assumptions and disrupting the economics that motivate hackers to attack. That is a lot to dive into there, Joe. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks, Jeremy. It's great to be here. I look forward to the discussion and look forward to chatting with you.
Awesome. Well, why don't we just kick things off with a little bit about RunSafe? I know it's a company that has been around for a number of years now, but maybe not everybody in our audience will have heard of RunSafe. So why don't you just provide a little bit of background to help us know a little bit about yourself and your organization?
Sure. RunSafe is set out to protect critical infrastructure from cyber attacks, and we do that by protecting the software itself that is deployed, whether it's in data centers or energy facilities or on airplanes or even on weapon systems. We are protecting software and doing it in a way that kind of matches our early vision for the company, and that is to fundamentally change the economics of the cyber attack. So we know attackers spend hours, weeks, months planning attacks, reverse engineering technology, and doing other things. And what we set out to do is, even if the attacker gains entry to a target device, we want to prevent their exploit from working in the first place. So unlike most cyber tools that are looking to identify vulnerabilities and perhaps fix them, we want to prevent the exploit from working in the first place. And so from that regard, it's been a wonderful ride because I work with fantastic people, folks that came out of the NSA and other places to do great work, both understanding exploit research and also asymmetric cyber defense.
Awesome. So there's a couple of things that I'd like to just dive into there, even just from that brief blurb. So one of the things that you mentioned is something that I think we hear a lot about, which is about, kind of prioritization of how we attack cybersecurity, right? So almost every organization that I've worked with over my entire career has had more cybersecurity problems than they have resources to deal with those problems. And so, I spent some time working in the vulnerability management space. I looked at cloud security, et cetera. And, the same was true again and again in those organizations. And so it was, let's find these vulnerabilities, let's eliminate them, let's maybe shift left our thinking so that if we're doing things in an automated fashion, we can kind of work these vulnerabilities out of our system designs before things go live. But you said something in that little intro there that I want to dive in on and make sure we understand for both for myself and for the audience, which is that even if we find the vulnerabilities, the attacks won't work. So help us understand, what does that mean?
Well, so again, in the first place, a lot of focus is put on shift left and helping developers resolve vulnerabilities and weaknesses that are in code. And of course, that is a necessary step, and it's certainly the best approach to build security in, to adopt secure by design practices and the like. But what's proven over the years, you could go back 30, 40 years, attackers still find ways to get onto devices, into systems, inside networks. They learn how to gain access. And so our fundamental assumption at RunSafe is attackers will gain access, but we want to prevent their exploits from working, even if they do gain access. And the way we do that is novel, and I'm sure we'll go into that in a lot of detail, and I'm happy to go into it now even. But the fundamental premise is that, if you are an attacker and you reverse engineer software, you rely on the same determinism that software, provides to all the system it deploys on. I think the great promise of software is, if you build 1 million copies of the software of a code base, it works identically on all 1 million devices. And that determinism is great. If it's an airplane, with all the same inputs, you get the same outputs. But from the attacker's perspective, that determinism also works in their favor. If they find a weakness or a vulnerability in a single instance of that software, they can build an exploit that will take out any of the airplanes in a fleet or the drones in a fleet or the vehicles in general. And so, our approach is to, target, to employ moving target defense in the software memory itself, so that even if there is a weakness in the code at runtime, it can't be exploited because the attacker can't find it.
Gotcha. So if you're saying like, hey, normally the software uploads something into memory space ABC123, and the hacker relies on this bit of running software code being at memory space ABC123, it may not be there. It will still be executing its proper function as we expect the software to do, but it might be doing that at PQR789 instead of ABC123, if I'm understanding you correctly.
100% right. And every time the software loads, all those functions go into different locations uniquely every time when RunSafe is applied. And so the benefit then is that attacker can't build the reliable exploit in the first place to work.
Gotcha. So I know that there has been some recent discussion around some of these exploits and some of the ways that exploits are, exploiting the vulnerabilities in some of this software code, up to the point of making some headlines, and there being some recent cybersecurity advisories and recommendations from the likes of FBI Director Christopher Wray, CISA Director Jen Easterly, NSA Director Paul Nakasone, with some recent testimony in front of Congress about the Chinese threat to U.S. critical infrastructure. What can you tell us about that? What was all the noise? What was all the news? What are some of the implications?
Well, the underlying problem that they're identifying has been out in terms of software weaknesses, has been out there since the late 1980s, early 1990s. However, in November of 2022, the NSA issued guidance, suggesting that those who deploy software across critical infrastructure need to achieve memory safety. And it was that guidance from the NSA that sort of started the ball moving in a pretty aggressive way. First, the Office of National Cyber Director got involved and said, part of our national cybersecurity strategy, we must achieve memory safety in software, which I can explain. But it went from there. CISA rolled out Secure by Design and included memory safety principles in there. Congress has funded programs to apply memory safety protections. And the DoD is developing policies in this arena. All that has happened in the past 12 months. And the reason why is because China is in U.S. critical infrastructure. And so the testimony before the Select Committee on PRC just a couple of weeks ago that you referred to was all about the fact that if China, decides they want to administer an attack, they already have access to U.S. critical infrastructure. So the point is the U.S. is vulnerable to Chinese cyber attack. And, from a RunSafe perspective and from a, national security perspective and just business continuity in a normal, well-functioning society, we really want to ensure that those attacks are not successful. And so I think what Director Wray, Director Easterly, and Paul Nakasone were suggesting and sharing with Congress was this is a real threat with immediate horizons. It could be in the next 2, 3, 4 years, something like this could take place.
Gotcha. And so if we think about this across critical infrastructure, I tend to think about critical infrastructure as being really difficult to kind of manage for a number of reasons. One is that these are a lot of systems with, embedded Linux versions, or they might be systems with even more restricted operating systems that aren't a full kind of, let's say interactive operating system. So when we think about that, coupled, by the way, with then, thousands of normal PCs and hundreds, if not thousands of workers. So you've got this kind of like very heterogeneous environment with everything under the sun from both a technology and a process and people perspective kind of falling under it. How do we think about addressing that threat and addressing that vulnerability? Because I know a lot of these systems are, let's say, like not frequently patched or updated. And when we think about vulnerability management, that usually is the solution to the problem is like, hey, let's get the latest patches, let's apply the latest fixes. maybe there's other things we want to do, like let's say microsegmentation and controlling blast radius for any particular event and so on. But when we think about such a diverse, heterogeneous environment that might span multiple geographies, et cetera, what are some of the core recommendations that you guys think about over at RunSafe to help people who operate those systems keep them safe?
Well, it's multifaceted for sure. And as you say, it's a hodgepodge of technology. It could be real-time operating systems. It could be embedded Linux, applications built on embedded Linux. These are OT networks that, are really there designed to make infrastructre work. It's not like IT systems, which may be web-based and may be web technology-based, tools with languages written in Python or, Java. A lot of the code, because it's been around for so long and because it's hard to patch, it was written 10, 20 years ago. It was written in compiled native code languages like C and C++. And those languages have inherent vulnerabilities that, folks like, attackers from China or other places, they really understand how to, find the weaknesses in those codes and attacks. So our recommendations have been, pretty consistent with what the government wants to do as well. We need to achieve memory safety in compiled code in C and C++. And we need to eliminate the ability for those attacks to happen. But to do that, what we recommend is really taking an inventory of all those assets, as well as generating a software bill of materials on those assets, identifying the vulnerabilities, and then finding which devices have the most attack surface exposed to these kinds of attacks, and addressing them with solutions that eliminate entire classes of vulnerabilities. And naturally, that's where RunSafe fits, is we eliminate entire classes of vulnerabilities, whether the vulnerability is known or unknown. And we do that by adding in our software memory protection. So if you take an inventory of assets, identify the software bill of materials, identify those vulnerabilities, prioritize those systems you want to address, and then apply protections that work independent of all the many different applications, operating systems, chip instruction sets, and all the variations that those hodgepodge of technology have, then we have a semblance of a way to address the issue without consuming a lot of resources.
And when we think about that exact kind of approach towards implementation, what should people know about where RunSafe works? Like, what are basic system requirements, not in terms of, let's say, the hardware and the performance aspect of it, but in terms of compatibility, where can customers think about deploying RunSafe?
Yeah, really, it's any of your devices that are deployed in critical infrastructure that are written in native code, written in C and C++, that work on a wide variety of operating systems, Linux, VxWorks, Lynx, Green Hills, and variations of all of those across instruction sets. So if the chips are Intel based, that works just as well as ARM based 32-bit or 64-bit processors and the like. And so what that means is it's really 95% or more of the software deployed in critical infrastructure kind of fits that broad category, even though I gave real specific technology. Yeah. And so as a result, that's what's happening is, that software is exposed. But the good news is there are things that we can do about it. We can apply RunSafe into the build process of that software so that all, future vulnerabilities, whether known or unknown today, can be protected.
And if I think about kind of the methodology that you're talking about in terms of protecting these platforms, it occurs to me that this is kind of a different approach towards vulnerability management, in a sense that it's not, let's say, eliminating the vulnerabilities by applying the standard patching and update and upgrade and so on, where, historically there have always been challenges around whether a patch might break a piece of functionality and so on, and, compatibility with third-party components and things like that. What you're suggesting is really just kind of like, hey, here's a completely different approach. You don't need to patch or upgrade because we know that those things might break your systems. What we've got here is something that'll take your existing systems and kind of just say, like, look, they're a moving target, as you said earlier. And so these exploits that could potentially be deployed against these systems, the likelihood of them failing goes, up. I don't know what the percentage is. And, you can talk about that if you'd like to. But really, that's kind of the approach that you're talking about here, if I'm hearing you right.
That's 100% the approach. And I think the fixing and patching cycle, some of our customers have identified over 4 years worth of fixes and patches they need to implement. And that timeline means that they're exposed to those same vulnerabilities in that period. So if we can dramatically reduce the time frame to and smooth out the patching process by virtue of preventing attacks from happening on those vulnerabilities in the first place, then not only do we save time, but we kind of save that critical crisis moment from folks. But with that said, just to touch on it, we work closely with North Carolina State University, who has done a fair amount of research on scanning tools, identifying vulnerabilities in Linux-based applications, and even the Linux operating system and other open source software, written in C and C++ languages. And the problem is even worse than just finding ways to patch and fix. Scanning tools do not do a good job of identifying the vulnerabilities that are memory-based vulnerabilities in the first place. North Carolina State University found is at least 80% of the vulnerabilities that get disclosed were never previously identified by a scanning tool in the first place. And so scanning becomes really an inventory of things that you have, of known vulnerabilities that you have patched or not patched. And in today's world, what people also need to think about is how they are exposed to future unknown zero-day vulnerabilities that can be compromised today because we don't know the vulnerability exists in the first place, but the adversary or the attacker does. And so we've been working with a lot of researchers to help identify those problems. And I think that's kind of fascinating. How can you assess your code to identify future zero-day potential, and find ways to reduce that attack surface at the same time?
And I mean, aside from using something like what RunSafe is doing, how can you identify what your future state, attackability is?
So in the case of memory-based vulnerabilities, which really are, the result of software weaknesses that allow the attacker to take remote control of a system, what you can do is, and without geeking out too much, there are ROP gadgets, and these are return-oriented program gadgets that attackers look for in code. And when they find a couple gadgets, they can string them together into a ROP chain and build a reliable exploit. So we've been working with researchers to identify how you can expose where ROP gadgets exist in compiled code. And that's the groundbreaking kind of breakthroughs, and there's a group we're working with to do that now. And the whole idea is to, use that to then say, how exposed am I not only to the known vulnerabilities today that I haven't patched, but the unknown ones in the future. And so, naturally, I think that has tremendous implications because if you think about like a DoD weapon system, scanning tools today don't do a good job, like I said earlier, of finding underlying vulnerabilities in proprietary code purpose-built for such things as weapons, written in native code languages like C and C++. Scanning tools just don't do a good job. But do you think the DoD is satisfied with understanding their underlying risk by relying strictly on scanning tools alone? So the answer is no, obviously. What do they do? They do other things. They might do penetration testing and invest in red teams to identify those weaknesses. We're looking for ways to automate that as well.
Interesting. It's one of those questions that I think I often get asked the question, how much is enough security? And it's one of the hard questions to answer because ultimately, the answer is, of course, it depends. And it's such a dissatisfying answer to so many people, myself included. And I've heard so many different people taking various approaches towards it. Previously, I interviewed 3 people who had written books on threat modeling. And they'll always say, hey, look, you have to rewind all the way back to identifying what your threat model is. And that comes down to identifying, what type of organization you are, who might want to be after you. What are your physical controls? What are your logical controls? Who are the people working for your organizations? What are the risks that they might present as insiders, et cetera? And they want to take this very kind of holistic step-by-step approach to go through every stage of an organization and then design a defense strategy that aligns towards where they think the highest risks and the highest threats are. And it makes a lot of sense on paper. The challenge that I see with it in the day-to-day is that nobody steps into an organization that they can start from zero and go back that far and design the threat model. Everybody steps into a running organization that's already up and running and has operations and might have products and technologies and systems and customers. And, it's the active runway problem, right? It's where you've got all of this stuff going on and you can't shut down everything to try to then reverse engineer what your threat model is and deploy a security defense against it. Meanwhile, shutting off things for X number of months until you do that. And so when we think about vulnerability management, I've seen a lot of dissatisfactory approaches on that side as well. But I think what you guys are proposing is really quite interesting and quite a different approach. I'd be curious, what can you share with us, if anything? And I know you may work with customers that are in sensitive areas like critical infrastructure, but what can you share with us about what some of your customers have experienced in using RunSafe?
Well, I think the biggest thing is that the entire class of vulnerabilities that I've been describing, the memory safety related issues, are comprise about at least 70% of the vulnerabilities in compiled code deployed across critical infrastructure. So if you take an approach where you can eliminate the exploitation of 70% of the vulnerabilities, imagine what that does to help optimize your threat models and your programs. It has a dramatic savings both in terms of attack surface and operational cost savings. And so I think those methods are all really good to help clarify how everybody talks about what they're trying to stop. But in critical infrastructure, what the NSA said, what the Office of National Cyber Director, what FBI Director Easterly from CISA have all said is we must prevent attacks on U.S. critical infrastructure and specifically solve the memory safety issues across critical infrastructure. So, I'm working on that guidance and finding ways to make that an easy way for our customers to deploy. And our customers do deploy easily. So you can deploy our technology in 15 to 30 minutes, and you can run our technology every time you do a software build and have the security protections built in. So it's very easy to deploy. And also, you don't have to change hardware. You don't have to change software. There's no impact to functionality. There's no impact to system overhead. We have customers working on big, massive engine controllers that have lots of compute power and processing power. And we have highly constrained small devices that have, maybe one chip and not a lot of parallel processing or anything else. And we can still deploy on that limited power constrained device without changing system overhead or performance or requiring any new hardware.
I mean, I think those last couple of sentences that you described there just really encapsulate a pretty strong value proposition. So if you think about that, you don't have to change devices. You don't have to change your code base necessarily. You don't have to change the running systems other than to kind of add this component in. Yeah, and I think that's really a great benefit to people using that. I thank you for sharing that. You mentioned something in there that I want to just make sure we don't leave this conversation without explicitly talking about, the guidance that came out after some of that testimony. I know there was a release. I don't know if it came specifically for the White House, but it was something around encouraging the use of memory safe languages. Maybe you can, I'm sure you followed it a little bit more closely than I can, and I'm sure you can share with the audience exactly what that mandate, executive order, I'm not sure exactly what to call it is, what it was, and actually just explicitly what are memory safe languages.
Right. So memory safe languages, are modern versions of code such as C and C++ that don't have the same inherent weaknesses that attackers rely on today to exploit embedded software across critical infrastructure. Now, what the guidance says from the NSA and what the Office of National Cyber Director is and CISA are also promoting is the adoption of memory safe languages. And of course, RunSafe supports, we've been using memory safe languages like Rust and Go and other languages ourselves internally to protect, some of our code bases. But the guidance goes further and says, product manufacturers, device manufacturers, folks like Schneider Electric and Eaton and Siemens should all rewrite all their products in memory safe languages. And of course, the challenge for those organizations is they have thousands of products that might have 10 to 30 year lifespans. And for them to invest all the time to rewrite their products in memory safe languages today is nearly an impossibility. There's no corporation that can justify simply rewriting 1,000 products in a new product language just to be more secure. So, it is that for that reason, we think RunSafe is a great alternative for people. You can achieve memory safety without rewriting a single line of code, but it goes beyond just rewriting. So a lot of these systems, even in critical infrastructure, are using 40, 50, 60, 70, 80% of their code is open source software, also written in C and C++. And that, as you mentioned, compatibility issues. If you update one component, you may have, an effect on other, items in your software image. And so, our premise is you don't have to rewrite any code. You don't have to, change, affect versions based on dependency trees by swapping out new open source libraries or components. You simply apply the software memory protection to the existing code, and you get all the benefits without rewriting and without the incompatibility.
Awesome. And then the guidance that came out, what was that specifically saying?
So in November of 22, the NSA said implement memory safe languages or other mitigations to solve for memory safety. The Office of National Cyber Director came out with its recommendations for open source software and basically said, also rewrite or implement. And then CISA has been the most comprehensive. CISA rolled out Secure by Design, which has a bunch of features to include achieving memory safety in the software that you write. But, some of the things you alluded to earlier, things like shift left and build security in and do the automated testing and everything else in all your releases to ensure that the code you release is free of defects in the first place. And that would be great. But we just know that defects don't just magically disappear, even with the best of processes.
Yeah, and I mean, even with the best of coders, defects don't disappear, and very often it can take years for defects to be found. I think we've seen recently last year, the largest, what I would call the largest single incident of the year, although calling it a single incident is kind of difficult, but MoveIt file transfer software from Progress Software was kind of the largest single attack surface, if you want to call it that, across the year. And it was thousands of organizations breached. And it was the kind of thing where the software had been out in existence. This version of the software had been out in existence for years. And, it took a lot of effort for the criminal organization that figured out the exploit to find it. But again, it was years later. It was years after the fact. So I think, Secure by Design, all of those things, they're well and good, but they may not serve for 0 days that are discovered many years after the software is released. This is one of the challenges one of the many, many challenges we face around software security in our fast evolving world.
Yeah, I like to say, so my youngest daughter is 17 years old and she'll be going to college in the fall. And there are vulnerabilities and exploits out there that are at least the same age. So apparently they're ready to go to college as well. They're growing up to be adults and have been around 15, 17, 18 years. And maybe they'll wreak havoc for longer.
Yeah, I mean, look, when I started in cybersecurity, my very first or second job out of university was pretty focused on cybersecurity with the organization that I was with. We went through pen testing. We went through many other things. We had to pass a clean bill of health, and our from our pen test results for a lot of our enterprise customers, et cetera. This is before SOC 2, by the way, so I'm dating myself quite a bit looking back on this. But I just remember all the things that we did. And I remember hearing the statistic at that time. And so we're in the early 2000s here. And the statistic was that most vulnerabilities that were identified on internet-facing systems lived for more than 180 days before being patched, right? Here we are, by the way, 2024. That stat is pretty much the same. And it's shocking to me that we've come from back in those days, building our own data centers, et cetera, to nowadays, cloud first, cloud native. By the way, hackers have cloud too. Hackers have automation. I tend to think everybody is a target nowadays, but the stats are the same. And it's really shocking to me that we've not found a better way to handle vulnerabilities in the 20 some years in between. So I think it's really interesting to hear an alternative approach. So I applaud you and the team over at RunSafe for what you guys are doing. I'm curious, aside from RunSafe, what keeps you up at night?
Well, I think, what has me most worried actually is, the fact that China has access to our critical infrastructure. And Director Wray went on the record to say that the U.S. intel community believes if China attacks Taiwan, does military action against Taiwan, it will also do a simultaneous attack in U.S. critical infrastructure. And they put that threat horizon window between 2027 and 2030. So, we talk about having these problems that exist for 10, 20, 25 years and things don't seem to change. We're 3 to 6 years from that event. So that keeps me up at night tremendously. I certainly have concerns about disinformation and AI and related social stuff that's affecting, that I see affect my kids who are, becoming adults. And so, they grew up on social media, and I just think the world is changing a bit. I think the pervasiveness of super apps that China deploys around the world, that also includes, sending out disinformation, but also includes payment information, e-commerce applications, and others. And if you combine all that data together, you have a pretty good profile of an individual globally, at a global scale of individuals and consumers everywhere. And so imagine the knowledge that China has on the global South, on U.S. Social media users, and payments and commerce in general. China dominates the top 10 in terms of digital, commerce and social media, and so I think we're exposed. And I think we need to be mindful of both the digital footprint we have and the social media footprint we have, and our cyber defenses. And unfortunately, I think all that stuff is building to a not pretty outcome. And so that keeps me up at night as well. And I do think there's time for us to turn it around. I am optimistic, but it just seems like we really need to, really take charge here and try to resolve some issues.
Yeah, I think that's a really strong message to end today's conversation. And I'll certainly echo the sentiment. One of the directors of an investment firm that we at Firetail work with, full disclosure, has a favorite saying, which is that cybersecurity is national security. And it's not that I personally believe that any particular nation state is a threat to me personally, but may have geopolitical intentions towards where I live, where I do business, where I work. And I think, every state, every organization wants the ability to have its own determination and operate its own systems in the way that it intends to operate those systems, free of interference, free of hacking, free of espionage, free of all of those things. And I think there are a set of assumptions and a set of kind of guidance and ground rules that many organizations operate on that maybe aren't being observed on a global level. And there's some asymmetry there. And so anything that we can do to kind of bring back control to the organizations that we serve and that we work with certainly goes a long way towards helping them in their own missions.
Yeah, and from our perspective, the RunSafe mission really is to make the world a safer place by fundamentally changing the economics back into the favor of cyber defense. And just to your point, I think I mentioned this earlier, but Director Wray talks about the fact that China has a 50-to-1 manpower advantage in cyber warfare in general over the United States. And so in my mind, innovation, technology, and asymmetric cyber defense is what's needed to counter a 50-to-1 person advantage. And so, I think RunSafe takes its mission out of exactly what you're describing. We think we're playing a small role in a broader, kind of geopolitical battle, if you will. But that role is important to critical infrastructure and important to the world to help keep things operating, in normal ways that, normal society expects.
Awesome. And with that, I will say thank you to you, Joe Saunders, for joining us today. For those who are looking to learn more about RunSafe, where can they find you?
Find us, certainly on the web at runsafesecurity.com. You can also follow us in LinkedIn, also at RunSafe Security, and even email us directly from the website.
Awesome. Well, Joe, thanks again for taking the time to join us today on Modern Cyber. Really applaud you and the team over there for what you're doing. Securing critical infrastructure is so important. And I'm sure it's more than just critical infrastructure, but securing your customers' organizations, the components that they're building is a very noble and worthwhile use of your time, I hope you feel, as I do. And for signing off from Modern Cyber, this is Jeremy Snyder. Thanks for joining us today.